He preferred to rule under the fig leaf of the old republic restored, and him just as the guardian of the republic, the first citizen, the princeps. But so Augustus is just consul at this point, consul again and again. He's too young to be consul, by the way, but he kind of ignores all the rules. And everyone knows he has enough power to do whatever he wants, but he's not as concerned with the forms as yet. And everyone also knows that there's not enough room in the empire for two egos the size of Octavian's and Antony's. Antony had gone off to Alexandria and become the lover of Cleopatra and had several children with her.
Who was Antony, just for context, so that people understand?
So Marcus Antonius, we say Mark Antony because of Shakespeare. So he is...
I thought it was because of the singer.
yeah, other way around. So he is one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants. And in the last years of Caesar's life, when Caesar was dictator in Rome, he helped Caesar. He was kind of one of his rabble-rousers, his hype man. And so after Caesar dies, he's well-placed to become one of the figureheads of Caesar's many supporters and his legions. So really, in the beginning, Octavian and Antony are fighting to be Caesar's heir. They're fighting to be the guy whom Caesar's allies and soldiers recognize as the new Caesar. And of course, that's what the struggle comes down to between them, that they want to be absolute ruler. Antony withdraws from Rome to take care of things in the east, which is much wealthier and really more interesting than the western provinces. He takes up with Cleopatra, who is the queen of independent Egypt at this point. Even though Egypt's kind of a client state of Rome, it's not truly independent.
So they were technically independent, though?
They still were then. The Romans hadn't, for about 50 years before the Romans actually conquer Egypt, Egypt's been dependent on Rome. They haven't actually taken it over.
What was the name of the civilization that starts with a P who was in charge of them before Rome?
The Ptolemies.
Okay, so did they... That's like PT?
Mm-hmm,
right?
Exactly.
So did they lose it?
Well, so they had less and less power, and they were in terrible debt, the later kings, and the Romans had basically taken advantage of this situation to put the Ptolemies in their debt, literally. Roman bankers would come in to finance these things and to make the Ptolemies do what they wanted, to make them agents of Roman policy in the East. But they hadn't taken it over. It was still technically independent.
Okay.
And so Antony comes into Egypt, and for partly political reasons, but mostly personal ones, we think, takes up with Cleopatra, has children with her, and even though he's married and has kids back in Rome, so this is bad PR back in Rome. And then even worse PR, declares his children with Cleopatra the kings of provinces that are Roman provinces in the east. So he's giving away Roman territory to these kids he has, the Egyptian queen. And of course, Octavian makes full use of this PR. He's like, okay, Antony's going Eastern. He's going all Oriental despot on us. And we can't have this. And so there's a propaganda war, which followed by a real war.
What does a propaganda war look like in, first century AD Rome? How does that work with the people?
A lot of bad-mouthing in the Senate, basically. You make, coins that show your guy, Octavian, in the company of, grand old Roman deities. You restore temples to show how much you care about tradition. And you spread slander by every possible means about how Antony is throwing away his Romanness and becoming this, Greek.
Goddamn Egyptian.
Goddamn Egyptian. Exactly.
Take your pyramids and get out of here, will you?
Exactly. Pretty much that, but in Latin. And so in the end, it comes to a head at the Battle of Actium, that famous naval battle off the coast of Greece in 31 BC, where the forces of Antony and Cleopatra are defeated by those of Octavian, after which he is the sole ruler of the Roman world. He goes on to Egypt then, conquers Egypt.
Do they have a meeting? Like after that, does Antony meet with...
No, because Antony and Cleopatra flee back to Alexandria, and then both commit suicide there when Octavian pursues them and besieges Alexandria. And so then Egypt, with all of its wealth and grain, becomes a Roman province, finally. Becomes actually the private property of the emperor, pretty much. He's very covetous of Egypt because it's so wealthy, and its grain is so important. And Octavian returns to Rome and gradually reinvents himself as Augustus. Even the title Augustus was carefully decided on. It means something like revered one, or respectable one, kind of like our adjective august.
Yeah, now we got a month out of it.
Exactly,
yeah.
Named after him.
Yep, exactly.
And as Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
And so he takes that title. He thought about Romulus as an alternative one. They're like, no, that's stupid to
Like
Augustus.
Remus and Romulus?
Yeah, like the first king of Rome. But it's
Yeah.
like, no, it's too much like a king. You want to be something new, different, Augustus.
Oh.
And then he has a series of, he takes on certain powers that have been held by other Republican magistrates and kind of cobbles together a position where he's not always the consul. He'll leave that open for other people, but has all the power of all of Rome's most dignified magistrates, and has a legal fiction for the real power he's always had, which is the power over the armies of Rome.
Yes.
So really, he's a military despot from start to finish. He has an army that he can unleash upon the Senate if he needs to. But he doesn't want to. He preferred to rule under the fig leaf of the old republic restored, and him just as the guardian of the republic, the first citizen, the princeps. And this position is maintained for quite a while, this fiction of princeps. Later emperors care less and less about that because it's established at this point. Everyone knows there's an emperor, one guy in charge. But when it's new, when there's still...
Got to ease him in.
Exactly, right. You know, it's the...
I'm not an emperor, I'm a shepherd.
Exactly, right. You know, we got there. And it helps a lot that he lives so long, that he's almost 80 when he dies.
Yes.
And for that reason, by the time he actually does go, everyone who remembers the Republic is dead, which really helps because all they remember is his rule. And so the transition to Tiberius, the next emperor, is pretty seamless.
But Augustus is officially where people say Pax Romana begins.
Mm-hmm.
So what do they date that to? Like 20 years into his rule? Like is it literally like right after Mark Antony's beaten? Okay.
It's kind of inexact, really. It's a modern term. You know, obviously the words Pax Romana, Roman peace, are ancient, but you know, using it as a period is modern. Often
I didn't realize that. So we came up with that way later.
Yeah.
That wasn't coined at some point.
Well,
like
it was
right
like a
after
slogan, like you see like Pax Romana like on coins and stuff, but it wasn't like a period that was recognized. It's sort of how we describe really the first 2 centuries of the empire. Often it's Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, and so they'll often say like 27 BC, which is the year Augustus takes on most of his powers as emperor, to 180 AD, which is when Marcus Aurelius dies.
It's 200 years.
Yeah. And even 180, you know, there are people who put it farther to like 235, which is the death of Alexander Severus. It's kind of a fuzzy thing, but it's of course, it describes the period where there are civil wars, there are disruptions, but for the most part, the Roman Empire is the most powerful state anywhere in Western Eurasia, has no real foreign rivals, and is generally characterized by peace and prosperity.
Is it during Augustus's time that we see a massive... I'm going to compare it to something else that's unrelated, but like a massive Renaissance type period. Like later we saw that with the Medicis and arts and philosophy and literature. But during like Pax Romana, is that when we're getting a lot of the, say, foundation of the cultural items like that would later shape things we do across all of Western civilization?
Yes. Actually, the reign of Augustus himself is the golden age of Latin literature. That's when Virgil, Horace, Ovid, all of the big names of Latin literature are writing, often in close association with the court of Augustus. There's this guy, Maecenas, who is a wealthy associate of Augustus, who is a patron for all these guys. And in return, they write poetry that kind of supports the regime in more or less subtle ways. It's like the Aeneid, written by Virgil, is kind of the foundational epic of Roman history and becomes the Roman poem, the thing that kids used to learn to read for the rest of antiquity. And this describes how Aeneas, this Trojan, has come over to Italy, and where eventually he'll intermarry with the Italian peoples. And it's meant to be a Latin rewriting of the Iliad and the Odyssey together. A challenge to the cultural supremacy of the Greeks. And there's a scene in which Aeneas goes down to the underworld and is shown the future, the great future of Rome. And all of this culminates pretty obviously in the reign of, guess who? Augustus.
Of course it does.
Right.
Marketing, baby.
Good marketing.
Very good
Or Livy, the great historian of Rome, is also writing in the reign of Augustus. And we don't know how he felt as much about Augustus because the later books of his history don't survive. But it's pretty clear that he views the new stability of Rome that's brought about by the reign of Augustus as an unambiguous good thing.
And this is also when the population of Rome like crosses 1 million.
We think so, yes. We have no clear data on that. But a judge from like the people on the grain dole, people receiving grain for the emperor, from the size of Rome itself, it seems pretty likely that about 1 million, even 1.2 million, is quite plausible.
How do you, because again, you studied like literally how to do this in college. So you're taught by professors where this is passed down and everything. But when you're looking at history this far back, I try to have, I hope I do a good job, but I try to have such an open mind on information changing over time as we find new sources or something like that. But to make calls, like that's pretty cool. They're counting like the grain that would come in, but how do they know that the sources of the data on the grain is correct? Like, how do you primary and secondary source the shit out of stuff to get like a good, I'm at a 98 or 99% confidence interval on X when it comes to studying this history?
Well, there's no hard and fast rule, to be honest. Very often, we only have one good source, one literary historical source for any given period. Even for like the height of the empire, for the reign of Trajan, for example. It's incredible how bad our sources are for this very prosperous period of the empire, because we just don't happen to have that narrative history. For many of our most iconic historians, like Tacitus, for example, the greatest Roman historian, who did write under Trajan partly, we had only one manuscript for some of his works. That was it. One single codex allowed him to survive the Middle Ages. And so when we come to a bit of information that's nowhere attested outside of one source, we often, if we can test it with archaeology, great. But if we can't, we can only take it on faith, or say acknowledge what the source is and how qualified it should be, and just try and use context and parallels from elsewhere and other ancient sources to say, okay, this is plausible, this is not plausible. That's all we have. We have this pool of evidence that's very large in many ways, but the depth varies for any given point. And all we can do is plumb it, know everything we can know about any period or place, and be honest about what we don't know.
You, by the way, also have an amazing podcast that I really like, where you have on unbelievable experts on.
Oh, yeah, they have some great guests.
Yeah, these topics from around the world. And what I like is you'll have on guys too that are really focused on one thing. Like, you had on one guy who was focused on like the history of slavery in the Roman Empire. It was wildly, I forget his name, but it was wildly fascinating. Do you remember who that was?
Jerry Toner.
Jerry Toner. Okay, shout out Jerry. But I think that was like episode 5 or 6 you had on your podcast. So we'll put that link in the description. But a lot of these guys, they'll get so focused on one thing and they become the source of that. And then it's like, they also may have the best intentions and be really good at what they do, but then we rely on them as the source of like this thing. And what if somewhere in their research, perfectly honestly, like they got this one little intricate part wrong, and then that led them down the wrong trail. So it's almost to me like, throughout the rest of my life, there will be pieces of this history in significant ways maybe that change based on new things we find or new people who dig into the field.
It's certainly possible. Actually, it's certain.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here